As certified life coaches with 45 years combined experience in human resources, Jen Trum and Catherine Fry have both experienced the highest of highs and the lowest of lows, both personally and professionally. And what they each know to be true is this: our mental, physical, and emotional health are the essential building blocks in order to thrive and shine in the field of HR. So in a first of its kind podcast, we'll be getting real and to discuss and share what has contributed to both our struggles and successes, with the goal of inspiring women around the globe to stand tall and take the necessary action to both thrive and shine in HR. Here are your hosts, Jen and Catherine. Good morning, everybody, and a happy Monday. Good morning, Catherine.
Good morning, Jen. How are you?
I'm doing so well. I am so excited for today. Today is our first kind of official episode of Thrive and Shine HR.
I could not be more excited. I'm thrilled
Same.
to be here with you. I'm thrilled to be here with everybody that's live, and I'm so excited for our listeners too.
Absolutely. So, let's kick this off with what our subject is today, because it's a heavy one and there's a lot of stuff to get into. So we don't want to waste a moment. Today, we're going to be talking about forgiveness. Forgiveness is a skill that is something that you had brought up in, your HR Empower Hour, and something that I wanted to jump right into. And for it being our first episode, I'm like, we're not wasting any time. But tell us a little bit about what prompted you to want to dive into forgiveness.
Well, let's just dive in, right? I think that for me personally, I got in my own way in terms of not developing my skill of forgiveness in the first, let's be honest, 20 years of my career. I did not understand it was a skill. I did not see how important it was. And I think it's also because I subscribe to more of an archaic approach to HR. So it led to some unnecessary consternation at work, but also in my personal life too. It definitely taps into both. And because you and I are so committed to getting real on this podcast and talking about the things that actually matter in HR, I thought, okay, the one thing that really stood in my own way, I want to talk about it. What about you? Why was it so important for you to talk about this skill?
Because one of the things that I've learned over the past few years is this shift in the way that I viewed what exactly forgiveness was, even as an HR professional and as a human being, right?
Exactly.
So as I was prepping for this podcast over the weekend, there was a quote that stopped me in my tracks. I'd never heard it before, and I was like, holy cow. The quote is from Martin Luther King Jr., and it is that forgiveness is not an occasional act. Forgiveness is a constant attitude. And I was like, whoa, right? Because that's not what we're taught. That's not how we are raised to understand what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is usually seen as this reciprocal thing between me and you, or because I'm bent out of shape because of this thing that happened or that circumstance that happened. And this shift in awareness around forgiveness, and it actually is a internal act that has to be practiced to the point that it becomes an attitude, that it becomes an awareness, that it becomes a lifestyle around, I don't hold shit. Like, I am not here to hold grudges and hold baggage. And so that, I think, is really what inspired me to say, oh my gosh, we need to talk about this.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I was diagnosed with a learning disability in the 7th grade. So oftentimes I misuse words. So I go to the dictionary often to look up exact definitions to make sure that I'm using the correct definition. And, of course, it's that forgiveness is that intentional decision to let go. And I love how you just described it. It's not a one and done. It's almost like a lifelong commitment to stepping back, noticing our resentment and our anger, and providing ourselves with the antidote. I mean, I think we've all heard that it's really not about the other person. It's forgiveness is about ourselves. And then I started parsing down the word. And when I think about for and giving, it's giving to ourselves. It's giving to that other human being, assuming that it's some sort of an interpersonal conflict. And I found that really, really fascinating. It's truly being so selfless and giving, which blew my mind a little bit.
It does blow your mind again, because this is how we've been, quote unquote, programmed, right? This is what we've aware of, what it means to forgive and not forgive, right? Is this idea that it requires this thing that's outside of ourselves. There was another quote that I read this morning that I was also like, damn, that's it. So this quote, and I don't know who said it, but whoever said it, you got it. Forgiveness takes away the power another person continues to wield on our lives. And it's not necessarily another person. It's whatever we're holding on to, whatever we are refusing to let go of, because we, have that sense of, by letting go, it means that it doesn't matter, that it didn't matter, and it doesn't. One of the things that I've learned is it may be something that actually impacts me for the rest of my life, right? Or it might impact me for a couple months. That does not impact my ability to forgive. Not only the circumstance, the other individual, and also, most importantly, myself. So it's like, I think that ability to be able to compartmentalize what exactly it is and how we can find freedom and peace by learning to let go of what we're holding on within ourselves.
100%. I actually volunteered at a local leadership program on Friday. It's called Roaring Fork Leadership, and I'm a graduate. I graduated in 2008, and the subject was on effective communication. But it kept coming, all of the examples kept coming back to HR, which I found really fascinating. It wasn't just HR professionals, but all of the topics kept coming back to terminations, consternation in the workplace. It was really, really interesting. And going back to forgiveness being an inner game, what you were talking about, there's a woman, her name's Dr. Jill Taylor. She's in the, I don't know exactly what department, but she's a Harvard professor, and she calls it the 90-second rule, that it's when something happens, our brain can only feel that emotion for 90 seconds. And it's the thoughts we choose that perpetuate that feeling of anger and resentment. Or we can pivot and we can choose thoughts that get us out of that consternation. So it's almost like that deeper level of what forgiveness is not and how we can transition into forgiveness. And that blew my mind. Anytime I read work by Dr. Jill Taylor, it just shows me that forgiveness is an inner game, and it's quite literally all in our brain, and we have a choice. We have a choice to choose thoughts that continue those feelings that we honestly don't want to be feeling, or we can choose different thoughts. So that's, I guess both of our minds have been blown all morning long.
No, I love Dr. Jill Taylor, and I love that because, it truly is, really that process of starting with ourselves and why we start with ourselves, and why I think you and I were so passionate to start this podcast is because the more that we can be aware of what is happening within ourselves, that awareness, I think, is how we can transform that our world, right? And so bit by bit, and I think the Lego pieces is really around how do we become more aware within ourselves. And so with that, you brought something up that I would love to dig into a little bit,
Yeah.
because we're going to get into some story time here in a minute. But before we do that, let's talk
Monday morning
about
story time.
every Monday story time with Thrive
Every
and Try to
Monday
Be
story
Fun.
time.
So let's talk about, though, what forgiveness is not, because we've already kind of
Mm,
put the framework around what forgiveness is, right? It's that letting go. It's that internal process that sometimes we think is reciprocal, or we think is about something outside of us. But how does it show up when it's not happening, both within ourselves and also in the workplace? So we did a poll over the weekend, put it out on Friday,
yes.
and we got the results of that poll. So first, I wanted to kind of start with you, Catherine, and just talk a little bit about what does, when you've seen both for yourself and for like others, what does it look like when there is a lack of letting go or
Oh,
forgiveness?
well, for me, it's a feeling in my body. For me, it's a tightness in my chest. I always feel it right here. And it's this holding on, this tightness. That's what it is for me. And when I feel that tightness, it's just a cue for myself, because I've done the work in the last few years, just like you've expressed. I became a coach, and coaching quite literally changed my life. And so when I do self coaching, I just have a lot more awareness around what's going on in my body. And I'm able to pause and say, okay, I know that my thoughts inform my feelings inform my behaviors inform my results. So my cue to myself when I'm having that feeling is just to step back, not with judgment and criticism, but with compassion, and say, what's going on, sis? Like, what is going on with you? And so I start taking a look at my thoughts. So that's what I do internally. What the opposite, what forgiveness is not, and how that shows up in the workplace for me in my 25 plus years of HR experience, is constant judgment. It's the constant flood of people coming into HR saying, he did this, she did this. And sometimes it's a true violation, right? A true violation of Title VII. But most often it's not. Most
Mhm.
often, it's a lot of gossip. It's a lot of bad attitudes. And most often, and what I see in my clients, which is wild. So now that I'm an HR coach, I specifically coach HR people. It's the not letting go of consternation with our bosses. That is the thing I see in my clients over and over and over again. So I
Yeah.
help my clients shift out of that and gain a different perspective. And quite honestly, help them develop their skill of forgiveness. What about you? I have the poll results, which I found super fascinating and super telling what HR professionals across the world are experiencing. But I'd love to hear from you on this one too. I mean, what do you think
Yeah.
forgiveness is not?
Oh my gosh. I think, over my years in HR, what you just said at the very end was like,
What did I say? I
was
don't even remember what I said. What did I say?
about,
I wasn't listening to
about
myself.
how often the inability to forgive includes those individuals that often are the closest to us in that
Yes.
professional environment. So that
Yes.
boss, that it's so often going to be, and those are the ones that I think are just so fascinating, and one that coming up in a little bit, I have a story around it, around a success story, because
Oh,
that
good.
holding on that sometimes that we do is something that can just perpetuate for years. And when we don't have an awareness around it, when we're not really aware of our own part in it and how we might be perpetuating the cycle, that I think is where it really can become tragic, right? And
Oh,
so,
yeah.
you know, anyway, so let's talk a little bit about the poll we did. So on Friday, I put a
Yeah.
poll out. I put it both out on Facebook and the Women of HR Support Group Facebook group, and also on LinkedIn, and got over 100 responses, about 110 total in both platforms. So basically, the
Over the
question for
weekend.
everybody
How cool is
over the
that?
weekend. I know I was late too. Little girl was tardy. was wanting to get it out by Wednesday and didn't get it till Friday, but still
Did you forgive
110.
yourself? Did you
I
forgive yourself?
I sure did on those ski slips on Saturday. I was all forgiving.
All forgiven.
So let's dig into the question. So the question I asked is, what does a lack of forgiveness look like in your workplace? And I said to check all that apply. So some of the things that I gave were a poor team dynamics, behind the back gossip, disengagement, refusal to collaborate and or negative attitude when collaborating, resentment or hostility, diminished employee well-being, and negative impacts to innovation and creativity. And there were answers across the board on
Across
every
the
single
board.
one. The
Yes.
ones that came out the highest, which is no surprise whatsoever, is either the refusal or the negative attitude when collaborating.
Yes.
And pausing there for just a minute, in my
Yes.
23 years in HR, how many examples I could come up with, we would have a podcast all day long, right? Like
We
in
wouldn't
that,
get any work done this week. We would be talking for the next 400 hours.
and I think every single one of you listening right now can completely relate, especially if you've been in HR for more than a couple of years. I mean, that idea, I think, of refusing or holding back or just being negative, grumpy, chip on the shoulder, that is what I think ends up perpetuating so much toxicity, so much unhealthy behaviors within workplaces. And the more that we as HR professionals can recognize it and call it out for what it is, and the impacts that it has, I think the more we are going to really be able to snuff the crap out of this, right, Catherine?
Okay, snuff the crap is a technical HR term, and we're going to do a whole podcast on snuff out the crap, not the crack. 100%.
Hashtag.
We're coming up with new hashtags, by the way. I think, Jen, I know you know this about me. I geek out on neuroplasticity. I geek out on neuroscience. And when I saw that percentage, it was the highest percentage, the refusal to collaborate, having that negative attitude, I was like, well, of course, that's the highest answer, because of our brain's natural tendency to have that negativity bias. And that's one of 5 tips I'm going to be teaching in just a couple of hours, HR Empower Hours today, because I'm going on vacation tomorrow. And when we understand the human brain, I think that's one of the power moves of being in HR, is understanding the human brain, understanding that our brain is hardwired for a negativity bias, and knowing that ourselves as HR professionals, but also teaching that in the workplace. That's a huge antidote to that perpetuation of that negative attitude in the workplace. When we teach our employees, listen, your brain is just doing what it is hardwired to do. You're not wrong. You're not broken. You're not a bad person. You're not a bad HR person. You're not a bad employee. Your brain is just doing what it's designed to do. And once my clients and the people in weekly HR Empower Hour in the workshop, they start to understand that, we start to step into our empowerment. And we start to step out of that resentment, because we start to understand, okay, it's just my brain, and I can start using my prefrontal cortex. I can start using my brain differently as the antidote. So I know I geek out in the weirdest way on these topics sometimes, but for me, I think that was a big shift in my brain a couple of years ago, just starting to understand neuroscience and how it relates to HR and how it can truly just get us from that state of consternation and that resentment and into that state of, okay, I'm just humaning. I'm just humaning. And so are my coworkers. It's pretty powerful. It's pretty powerful. I think it's a huge part of forgiveness. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, similar to what I was sharing earlier, is the more that we the more that we talk about it, I say call it out and snuff that crab and all of that,
Yeah.
but really it's about normalizing what's human, right? The
Yeah.
humanizing of what is very, very natural and human, reactions and
Yes.
behaviors. And I think that's one of the things that I almost find maddening in a way, because what we can't see in the work environment is really what's most important, right? It is the thoughts, the beliefs, the feeling, everything that I
Yeah.
think is behind every one of those humans
Right.
that we're working with. And so,
Right.
learning the different skills on how to become more human and being able to talk about what's really under the surface, I think is just the superpower of all. like we could go
100%.
on and on. So
I know. And I just feel that can provide some relief for HR professionals, because if we're still operating under you know, the traditional HR model of black and white thinking of here's the rule, here's the expectation, figure it out, that can directly lead to a lack of forgiveness in the workplace.
mhm.
This is what it is. It's a right and wrong mentality. And I feel when, as HR practitioners, when we're really deeply rooted in that there's a right way and a wrong way, it's sort of, it keeps that anti-forgiveness culture going in the workplace.
Yeah.
There's a
Yeah.
different way to HR. There's a different way to approach HR so that our mental, physical, and emotional health is in a healthy state, truly. And that's the other reason we wanted to do this podcast. And to me, it's just like, once I figure that out, and when I help my clients figure that out, it's just, you're blowing your own mind. You cannot believe that you've gone through life for so long, looking at life through a certain lens when there's a whole other way to go about it, whole other way to HR too. It's the best thing ever.
Totally, totally.
Totally.
So let's talk a bit with that poll. A couple other
Yeah.
things that came up I want to chat about
Yeah.
before we
Great.
start getting into like skills and resources and some good takeaways with this episode. But
Yeah.
a couple of other things that came up. The second answer of what does a lack of forgiveness look like in your workplace that came up the highest was behind the back gossip.
Yeah.
And that was another one that really hit me because, it's so interesting that so often people really truly believe the venting, the being able to kind of have that support system, right? And the support systems that we have in the workplace that tend to then be just fueled, right? We're human beings with a natural tendency towards a negativity bias anyway, right? And when we are unchecked and living in the subconscious world, these cliques, these groups, this, power of, people coming together in the workplace, that's where it fuels this gossip around it being negative and harmful and toxic. And so one of the things that I've learned in terms of a super skill for us in HR to
Yeah.
really be able to utilize is knowing that, is
Yes.
recognizing that, right? I think it can be so frustrating. It can be so frustrating within HR to be like, this silo, this click, this, that.
Yeah.
Totally natural and normal. And so it's kind of the more I think we can understand the neuroscience and all of the things behind it, and then the
Yeah.
more that we can self-check within ourselves, that piece around the behind the back gossip that's going on constantly that sometimes can just fuel us with frustration and anger and all of these things, I think you can flip that pretty
Yes.
easily and be able to say, oh, okay, this is exactly normal. This is exactly the way that it's going to function naturally. And my role gets to be how we can start to be able to shift these dynamics, right? But I've
Exactly.
got to begin again with myself. Because if it's fueling me in any kind of trigger, and this is where I will talk to every one of you out there around self-check and recognizing within ourselves,
Mm.
what are those things? I know we all have them. What are those things that we know within ourselves are hard to let go of? Is it our manager? Is it the coworker? Is it something else within our work environment? Check in with yourself and spend a moment either now or at the end of this episode and really recognize, because the
Mm.
more that you can do that, the more that you can say, ooh, you know what? In our small HR department of 3 people, we actually sometimes do gossip a little bit. And it sometimes does find its way down a slippery slope. And I think for myself, when we start talking about like skills to use, this is where it really, really comes to play. So, Catherine, tell me your thoughts on this.
I couldn't agree more. And I don't want to double down on what you just shared. I just want to extend that once we as HR practitioners, whether we're a department of 1 or we're a department of 3 or 300, once we start to call ourselves in, not calling ourselves out, we call ourselves in. And we
Mhm.
start with compassion and with kindness, start to recognize these things in ourselves and others. We can then start to teach it within our own organization. And it is the most powerful thing that when we think about KSAs and HR, we don't think about on the job description listing the skill of forgiveness. And when we start to understand how powerful that skill is and why it's so important, we start to teach it. We start to put it in our learning and development programs. Jen, I'm curious if you have had success either in the workplace or personally in terms of seeing that skill of forgiveness play out in a really great way. Do you have any like success stories at all?
Yeah, I do. So I had the opportunity to work with a gal who was in a leadership position of a really small department. So it was only her and 2 other ladies. She'd been
Yeah.
in her role over 10 years,
Uh-huh.
um, actually about 12, 13 years. The other 2 ladies had both been in their roles for quite a long time as well. And over time, she started to get involved in self-help things. I mean, she just was starting to take more care of herself. She was
Yeah.
starting to kind of put in the work, right? The quote
Yes.
unquote work. And
Yes.
it was starting to shift her. And she was starting to recognize where she needed to take more accountability in her own life and where she needed to take more
Mm.
control over the thoughts and the words that ended up coming out, because what she was starting to notice is how much she would be right in there with her 2 employees commiserating about this manager and this department and that department. And over time, as she continued along her journey, she really was recognizing, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be this person anymore. And as a leader, I'm starting to recognize that I am part of the problem. And so she had come to me initially, through HR and wanted some help. And through my coaching, I was able to really sit with her and help her put a plan to, really put a plan together on how are you going to be able to shift this? Because she ended up having an interaction where I think many of us can relate to, right? Where we
Yeah.
really want to make a change within ourselves. We want it so bad. I want to now be this person, right? But other people around us are like, no, no, no. No, no, no. Like, you are
Yeah.
this person to me. And therefore, whatever that looks like to whatever person, when, that change we're trying to initiate, right? So for her, that pushback of, well, wait a second, we just don't want to vent about that, 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 that. And she didn't know how to handle that, right? That created a
Mm.
flood for her where it ended up causing her to be snippy and, very difficult to kind of handle, to regulate that. And so over time now she's having to like be able to continue to kind of find her way through all of this, but it's complicated, right? Changing ourselves, recognizing where we're holding ourselves back, making the conscious intention of shifting that. This is all powerful stuff. And so her doing that and recognizing this is a process, like
Yeah.
we had to kind of come back together. So we literally took about 6 months together to get to the point where she now
Yes.
felt really comfortable to be able to be that person as herself. So
Yeah.
really, for anybody out there who can relate to that, who's ever been like, ooh, I got to change this about myself, and those around me are pushing back on that, that is a tough journey. That is one that
Yeah.
can be, you've got to find that support system in that. But I think I was so grateful for her in that moment to be able to say, I don't think I could do this on my own. I need some help. And we were
Right.
able to do it. So I'll pause. Thoughts
I
or
I love that. And I love that you brought up the fact that you said it took 6 months.
yeah, about
This
six
doesn't
months.
happen overnight. I mean, if you think about how long your brain has been in this state of, I'm just going to call it out, resentment and anger. I could not agree with that more. And when I'm working with my clients, I call it choose your hard. So you
Oh,
can
yeah.
either continue to feel that anger and resentment and hold on to that, or you can start to do the work to change the way you see the situation, to change the way you're showing up, and to change your perception of that other person so that you can start practicing that skill of forgiveness. And it is a practice. It's like going back to soccer practice when we were kids. You didn't just suddenly become great at getting the ball into the goal, you had to practice. So it is a practice. And when we think about how deeply rooted some of the things are that we've held on to for so long, as you were talking, I was thinking about a woman that I coached whose father really had high expectations. Okay. We're talking, wanted her to be super thin, and also wanted her to be an extreme high achiever. She became a lawyer. Okay. But what happened for her, she was in her early 50s when we started coaching. She was so resentful of her father that her adrenal glands were failing. It had been a lifetime of just holding on, being really, really angry with her father. And by the way, that story really spoke to me because I too held on to this anger of my dad for such a long time. I really resonated with her story, and how it showed up in her was a failure of her adrenal glands. So in coaching, long story short, she went through EMDR. She went through a whole process of relieving that resentment, practicing forgiveness. That was the path that she chose that was right for her, right? I coached her in a way that I didn't tell her what to do. She knew what she needed to do that was going to provide that relief. And she has dropped so much weight. She's feeling so much better. She's so much more confident in her role because she developed that skill of forgiveness. And I think about it with my father. It was my coach that I hired 3 or 4 years ago who helped me shift those lifelong stories and narratives I've been telling myself about my dad that were quite untrue. And as at that time, a mid 40s woman, I was in my 40s, I started seeing that story I've been telling myself my whole life was creating problems at work, problems in my relationships. And once I was able to practice self-forgiveness and forgive my dad, I did it through this total truth letter that I help my clients through as well. Once I was able to do that, my whole world changed. My relationship with my dad is so close. I may start crying. So close now. And that resentment I held on for my whole life until I was in my mid 40s held me back professionally and personally.
Mm.
And it's just been such a game changer. Once I figured that out, and I've seen my clients, it changes lives when we develop that skill of forgiveness in such a powerful way.
Wow. Wow. Thank you
Right?
for sharing that. Yeah.
Open book
Wow.
here. Open book.
No, thank you so I mean, this truly is why we're doing this, right? Is like
Yes.
we are our whole selves all the time. And I think our whole selves, when we really can bring that to this this moment, this
Mm.
opportunity, I think, yeah, I had chills. So thank you so much for sharing that
Mm.
because
Always.
I want to shift it a little bit
Yeah.
around, how then, that lack of forgiveness can really go wrong and perhaps, examples that you and I have both experienced that we can look back on. And for me, it was something I can look back on as a failure, mistake, whatever you want to call it. But again, like for those of us on this journey, the more that we reframe looking at those failures and mistakes as opportunities to learn and grow,
Yes.
better off we'll be. So what I do describe as a failure that really helped me recognize my own part when it comes to forgiveness has to do with a co-working relationships that I had
Ooh.
years ago where I was in a role where it had been created and I was the creator of the role. It was so freaking awesome, right? I was in a role where we were creating this whole new position and I
Yes.
was kind of the builder of it, working with the CEO, working with the, all these people. And then once this role was created, it felt very, I felt very proud of it, right? It was
Yes.
something that I built over, months and months. And then came the time, and this is a fast growing and large organization. So it came the time to then bring in other people who were also going to do this same role that I created. And as I did so, what I was not fully conscious of at the time was how much my little ego and that pride actually seeps in to what I was holding on to, what I was
Whoa.
having a hard time letting go, what it was difficult for me to like train and be able to collaborate.
Whoa.
But yeah, so it was like not intentional, right? It was totally
No.
subconscious. And it was the little girl inside of me totally, like all this fear around, all of it. So looking back and you talk about like how you can now see things in retrospect, it's like so powerful, right? It's not to go back sometimes to shame ourselves or to, to like pile a bunch of regrets on ourselves, but really it's to go back and go, oh, that was ego.
Yes.
Like, that was ego. That was me not being mature enough to really recognize it's completely fine that this other person's coming into the role that I created. I now get to train them. I have the opportunity to like help them grow and evolve. But at the same time, I'm
Mm.
still navigating the relationships of the managers I used to work with that I'm now giving to this other person. Right. So there were parts of this that were letting go that I wasn't fully conscious of. So I think in terms of like how sometimes we can really check again that going back to checking in with ourselves if we're finding
Yes.
it hard to let go of something, if we're finding that there's this one person or this group of people that continue to get on our nerves, explore that shit. Explore it because
Yeah.
that's the key, I think, to really being able to like understand where we actually might be part of the and I know that's not fun. I know that's not the enjoyable part is to like see, oh yeah, that's partially me. But it's what really I think is going to help elevate each and every one of you as an HR professional. So Catherine, I'd love
Well,
to hear from you.
I mean, I know we think of it as not being fun, for that personal accountability, so to speak.
Yeah.
And yet it is just wild how when we start to understand what our brain's doing, that relief that we feel. And when I mean we can all relate to, okay, I understand that the anger and the resentment and the feelings that I'm having because of that lack of forgiveness. And I just think when you're on the other side of it and you do start to practice it and you start to help other people practice it in the workplace, once you've gone through it, that feeling of freedom, that feeling of relief, that feeling of being human, that feeling of compassion, it's just so worth it. I don't know why I wanted to share that and why I started even talking about that, but it is just, it's everything. And it's everything that I feel as though HR professionals really need to understand as we start to head into 2024. It's just a whole new ball game. Our workplaces are so dynamic and they're changing all the time. And I do feel like in HR, we carry a lot of the weight of the world on our shoulders. And this is just one way to lighten that weight. When we're lighter, when we practice what we preach, it's just, we can actually start to enjoy HR. We can
Absolutely.
yeah. When we just take that step back and call ourselves in, it's pretty awesome.
100%. So you brought up something that I think is really important to highlight. So there was actually, well, you didn't bring it up, but you definitely triggered in my brain.
Oh,
So
good.
there was a recent study in SHRM that talked
Yeah.
about why are people leaving post-pandemic? What is it people are really looking for? Because there's no doubt about it. You find me a study out there that says our brains have not shifted since the pandemic, and I will I will dig right into that because it's very, very clear, right? Like that pandemic shook up everybody in one way or another. And so really looking at the data that's now coming out around what matters to people, right? Like what's keeping people and what's pushing people away. The number one thing on this recent SHRM study around why people are thinking of leaving or wanting to leave is around the inner part, the inability to let go of interpersonal, shoot, I'm trying to remember exactly do you remember what it was? We were talking about that not too long ago, but it has to do with the feeling of mistreatment or misbehavior by coworkers or leaders, and
Yeah.
do you know what I'm like, all of a sudden I drew a blank, but it was a study that basically said that people are leaving because they don't feel as though they are being cared about and that they don't feel like there's an environment that really is listening to them. And
Yes.
so, from the perspective of forgiveness and the opportunity that we have as HR professionals to really tap into what it is people really need. They want to be heard. They want to connect. They want to be involved. They want to be a part of the solution. And I think all of that comes down to understanding what's holding us back, right? What is holding us back from that? And to think it's outside of us, to think that we need to run away and get that next job or that next place is really, I think, that fallacy when it really, truly always comes down to what's going on inside.
100%. And I think as HR practitioners, we've all been trained to deal with the external variables. And when we understand that forgiveness is an inner game for ourselves, but for others, we can start showing up for our employees in a different way. It goes back to that old adage, people don't quit their jobs, they quit their bosses. And that's totally true. And the study that you just spoke to speaks to that. We quit how other people are making us feel. But people can't make us feel a certain way. And the antidote to that, the related skill to forgiveness is that skill of curiosity. It's the antidote to what our brain is naturally going to want to do, sitting in judgment of other people and getting curious. And as HR people, we want to truly understand the why, what inspires people. What inspires them to come to work? What inspires them to make them stay? And when we start asking the questions of our staff of, well, what do you want to be experiencing? It's almost like a stay interview almost. But describe the environment you do want to experience. We're helping our employees and our culture shift from what we do want what's going to perpetuate that negativity bias to what we do want.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit trippy in my mind. It still trips me out a little bit because I think our brains are so hard and we've been taught to approach work over here.
Mm-hmm.
And when we start approaching work with, well, what do you want? What do you want to be experiencing? What type of relationships do you want to have in the workplace? And why is that so important for you? When we truly start asking those what and how questions, I mean, that's just like coaching 101. And it just starts creating a forgiving type of culture. We allow ourselves to be more human in the workplace and not only show up authentically, but to also be much more forgiving because humans make mistakes. We make mistakes right and left all day long, all day long. So instead of chastising that, as you said earlier, we learn and grow.
Yes.
I feel like I just went all over the place on that. I followed my own brain. Did you follow my brain?
I am right with you. I am right there with you. So as we wrap up, I wanted to, I think what you just did was the perfect lead in. So it's like, she's good.
Really?
You
Not
know,
planned.
let's really, kind of end off today and talk about like what do we as coaches recommend to those listening out there around how they can build the skill of forgiveness within themselves and in their workplaces. So you want to go first or you want me to jump in?
Jump in, and something tells me it'll inspire me.
Okay. So in terms of what, again, when we go back to thinking about what forgiveness is, and that shift of awareness, I think is something that's going to take time for us to really get and understand. For me, I was 48 years old before I really understood what forgiveness was. That's 48 years of programming and thinking forgiveness needed to happen outside of myself. So that's number one, and having grace within ourselves, having compassion. You used the word compassion earlier, and I'm like, yes, girl, compassion for ourselves when it comes to the process of really understanding what forgiveness is, and then being able to kind of flip that dial. Because I'm telling you right now, when you start to really understand within yourself what forgiveness truly is, you start to be able to look at everybody around you and all their drama and all their issues with so much more compassion.
Yes.
So I think that is something that has changed me fundamentally, is the more forgiveness and compassion I have for myself, boom, there can be a complete hurricane going on around me. And if I am dialed in to forgiving myself, having grace with myself, having compassion, then everyone else is struggling the same struggle. And whatever it is that's coming out of them, frustration and anger, all of these emotions, right? All of that, just remember it's not about you. It's not about you. It is always going to be about them. And it might feel that way, and it might definitely trigger you in ways that are very uncomfortable. But the more you can settle into it, be okay with that, let that 90 seconds go by, the more you're going to be just fine. So, couple last things before I shift it to you, and then we get out of here, because I went on to the Mayo Clinic. I know you did a little research too. So on the Mayo Clinic, it says, what kinds of things can we do to help us move towards a state of forgiveness? Bit of a list here. So one of them I've already talked about, recognizing the value of forgiveness, recognizing it, right? Really understanding how it can improve our lives by practicing it. That's it. That is number one with a bullet, y'all. Recognizing it and understanding the power it has in your life. Number two, identify what is the healing. What do you need to forgive? Where is it that you might be stuck and might need forgiveness? And then in addition to that, when you are out there in the world, right, and you're seeing your boss and you're seeing the coworkers and you're seeing that frustration within them, what is it that they have not yet forgiven? What is it that they might be holding on to? Because the more that you become inquisitive, I heard you, mention curiosity, the more inquisitive you become, it's such a power skill, because then you don't have to like go into any types of judgment. You can just be with what it is. So, and then joining a support group or getting a coach, counselor, acknowledging the emotions themselves, right? Being really honest about what emotions are there so you can then be able to work through them yourself. Because I think, last point in this, at the end of the day, our emotions are always our responsibility. As much as we may seek and desire reconciliation or awareness or understanding from the other person or the other party, at the end of the day, we may never get it. And so it's so important to remember that forgiveness is the more that we try to attach to a certain outcome with it versus our own internal growth that we can gain from it, the more I think we get lost, and it can become frustrating. It can become overwhelming. And then we give up and we don't, we just shut down. So anyway, I think I've said enough. I'm going to put it to you and then we can wrap this thing up.
I love the research you did. And it made me think of a couple of things. Don Miguel Ruiz wrote a very famous book called The Four Agreements. Jen's like, I love that book. I love it. He also wrote a book called The Fifth Agreement. And in The Fifth Agreement, it was more taking the four agreements and applying it, which is what HR Empower Hour is all about, right? It's taking the information and applying it. So I'll be going through my 5 tips in class today. But what you just made me think of was, in the Fifth Agreement, my greatest takeaway was, the greatest battle we will ever have in our lives is the battle within our own brain. Battling that lack of forgiveness, being in constant judgment. And I think when we recognize that this battle is all up here, that's also our greatest HR power tool, is our brain, and understanding it's just an internal battle. It's just narratives we're telling ourselves. What is a different narrative that might exist? Looking for that contrary evidence. And once we can do that in ourselves as HR practitioners, we can start to teach it in the workplace as well. We can start to show up as an HR coach and start coaching the employees on developing that skill of forgiveness. But before we can go there, we have to truly start developing that skill ourselves. You don't have to be a master. You just have to start experiencing the shift so that you can therefore start to teach it in your organization. So I had something else I wanted to share and I can't remember what it was. But I think we've covered a lot today. Been so fun covering a topic that we rarely talk about in HR. And I just love it.
We sure did.
Another HR podcast covering this one. So I just love that we get to talk about things that you and I really have known have made a difference in our lives. And we just want that for all of our listeners and everybody who's on live right now, to experience what true forgiveness actually brings into your life. It's a game changer.
Absolutely. So I want to end with a quote. So as we end, I want to end with a Deepak Chopra quote. And he says, forgiveness is an act of self-love. When we forgive, we free ourselves from the chains of resentment and open our hearts to healing. So with that, I want to wish you all a wonderful week, and I hope everyone out there is thriving and shining in HR. Have a great week, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week.